Yes. Yes, I did. She tapped the page of her open notebook as if to confirm her words, and when his eyes followed the movement, she hastily closed the book, not wanting him to see her scribbles. His brow lifted and his head tilted as his eyes burned into hers, and she smiled breezily up at him. She'd just check his dictaphone later to figure out what it was she'd missed. No problem. Well? He asked. Crap. Now what? Yes, I got it, she repeated slowly, as if to an inattentive child. His eyes narrowed dangerously. God, he was scary when he did that. Okay, so maybe this was something he wanted done right away. That wasn't good at all. She'd have to cop to the truth. She leaned in toward him and was a little offended when he leaned in the opposite direction. I didn't quite get the last bit, she confessed, and his eyes flared with what looked like disgust. How was she supposed to know they'd suddenly switched to English? Okay, so she should probably have been paying closer attention, but after 3 hours of nothing but Japanese, she was bound to have zoned out at some point. I want you to arrange a meeting with Craig, Josh, Ryan, Tanaka-san, Inokawa-san, Watanabe-san, and myself for 3:30 this afternoon. Cleo ducked her head as she quickly scribbled the information on a blank sheet in her notebook. You may use this conference room for the meeting, Knight-san, Ms. Inokawa said in her breathy little voice, shocking the hell out of Cleo with her English. Could they all speak English? If so, how rude of them to not once acknowledge her lack of Japanese. Then again, she was just the assistant, who couldn't even do the only thing that had been required of her at this meeting efficiently. The meeting was apparently adjourned because the men bowed and shook hands. Ms. Inokawa was speaking in that charmingly girlish voice, all the while smiling sweetly, while Cleo was left to her own devices, alone at the table. She got up ostensibly to stretch, and finally made her way over to the fly-tainted, stale-looking pastries. Knight, get on those phone calls, Dante growled from the other end of the room. Cleo swallowed down her resentment before fishing out the company phone to contact the architect, the contractor, and Ryan Blake, the company's legal representative, all of whom were staying at the same hotel as Cleo and Dante. After a series of meetings with the 3 men the previous day, the boss had wanted to meet with the Japanese alone this morning in order to straighten out the mess he believed the other men had created. So if he was calling them back in, it must mean he'd made some headway in that morning's meeting. The speed at which they all answered their phones attested to the fact that they'd probably been anxiously awaiting her call, and Cleo set up the meeting within minutes. Dante was still amicably chatting with the Japanese trio, but the moment she disconnected the second call, he looked at her with a raised brow. She nodded in response to the question she could see in his eyes, and he went back to his conversation without acknowledging her affirmation. Stifling her irritation at his rudeness, she started compiling a list of all the documentation they would need for the second meeting. She was well engrossed in that task when Dante's voice, coming from directly behind her, startled her back into the present. Are you coming? Inokawa-san has arranged lunch for us, he informed her, and Cleo bit back a groan of relief. She jumped up quickly before he could revoke the invitation and swayed slightly as the lack of food and jet lag hit her. His hand caught her elbow and steadied her. What's going on with you? He hissed. I haven't eaten much of anything since the in-flight meal yesterday morning, she hissed back. So excuse me for feeling a little lightheaded. Nonsense. You had dinner last night and breakfast this morning. He waved his hand dismissively, refuting her claims with innate arrogance. No, you had dinner and breakfast. You told me we'd have a dinner meeting and ordered only enough for yourself, and if you consider that one piece of bacon and mouthful of eggs I gobbled down this morning breakfast, then you and I have seriously different ideas of what constitutes a healthy meal. His brow lowered as he considered her words. Then he tilted his head toward the pastries on the nearby table. And this is why you've been staring at that table like an addict eyeing her next fix? Okay, is that a glint of laughter in his normally enigmatic gaze? That was different. I'm starving, she said flatly, unamused by his amusement. We'll remedy that immediately, he assured her, squeezing her elbow briefly before letting her go completely. Cleo tried not to cry while she stared down at the minuscule serving of sushi in front of her. Ms. Inokawa had reserved a trendy sushi restaurant for lunch, and though Cleo wasn't a huge fan of Japanese food, she'd eat it if she was desperate enough. However, she hadn't been expecting a child-sized portion of food. She wasn't the biggest of women. Dancing kept her lean, and her frame was ideally petite for a dancer. But she had a healthy appetite, and the prettily decorated plate in front of her barely contained enough food to feed a gnat. She was about to dig in when a hand clamped down on her thigh and squeezed painfully. Her shocked gaze flew to Dante's impassive face, and he turned his head to glare at her before nodding toward Mr. Watanabe, who was speaking. She belatedly recalled the cultural etiquette booklet she had speedily read through on the plane, and remembered eating or drinking before your hosts was considered extremely rude. Apparently, Mr. Watanabe was going to ramble on for a while before giving the go-ahead to eat. She stared at her sushi glumly and took solace in the fact that at least it wouldn't get cold, and her little friend Damaso Jr. was probably still back in that stuffy boardroom, gorging himself on stale donuts and eclairs, and therefore unable to ruin this meal for her. Mr. Watanabe finally stopped talking, and everybody picked up his or her chopsticks and proceeded to eat with great gusto. Damaso-san, you use chopsticks very proficiently, Cleo heard Miss Inokawa, seated on Dante's left, say in her breathy voice. Seriously, like the man wasn't arrogant enough. She was going to stare at him with those big brown eyes and fawn over him because he could use chopsticks. He modestly thanked her for her compliment, and Cleo choked down her sushi, trying very hard not to be sick. A few minutes later, she nearly was sick when she stared in horror at the plate of sashimi that had just been placed in front of her. Her hand fluttered to her mouth as she swallowed back her nausea. Don't you dare, Dante warned, leaning toward her and keeping a pleasant smile on his face to disguise the warning. But they're alive, she practically wept in reply. The sashimi shrimp on her plate were writhing weakly and had quite effectively killed her previously ravenous appetite. You don't like odori ebi, Knight-san? Mr. Tanaka, who had been chatting shyly with her in broken English, noticed her reaction. It's very fresh. It's not fresh, she said from behind her hand. It's alive. Yes, Mr. Tanaka nodded, smiling encouragingly as he made an eager go-ahead gesture with his hands. Fresh. Taste. Taste. I don't think... She was on the verge of tears, horrified at the thought of the shrimp dying in her mouth. It was hypocritical, sure, but if they died even just seconds before being served to her, she would happily have eaten them. But the thought of them dying between her teeth or on her tongue, or as they slid down her throat, totally grossed her out. She turned pleading eyes on Dante, whose face was completely expressionless. I can't. He turned to their companions, said something in Japanese, and they all roared with laughter. Oh, Damaso-san, you are so funny, Ms. Inokawa chortled. Yeah, hilarious, Cleo muttered beneath her breath. A slanted glance from him confirmed that he'd heard her. She directed another distressed look down at her plate, and a pair of chopsticks swooped into her line of vision and grabbed one of the poor creatures. Don't worry, Miss Knight. I'll save you from these creepy crustaceans, he mocked, before dipping the poor thing in soy sauce, hopefully drowning it and popping it into his mouth. You're just prolonging their suffering by letting them writhe like that. She was ridiculously grateful to him for handling the situation, even though he had made her the butt of the joke to do so. The incident was soon forgotten, but as the dishes grew progressively more unappetizing, sea urchin, her queasiness and exhaustion made her feel more ill with every passing moment. Lunch stretched on for ages, and when it finally ended, Cleo, who had barely touched a morsel, had a huge headache and felt a little punch-drunk. Miss Knight, contact the driver and head back to the hotel to draft those emails we discussed earlier, Dante said as the group got up from the booth. She stared up at him blankly, wondering what she'd missed this time. He waved the other three ahead of them, and Cleo tried to focus on his face and what he was saying, which was difficult when she felt like a zombie. I'm sorry, I don't recall the emails you're referring to, she said, hating to reinforce his already low opinion of her. There are no emails, Knight. Go back to the hotel, take a shower, order room service, and get some sleep. The jet lag, combined with the busy evening and... His eyes darkened, and his voice lowered sexily. Exhausting night you had yesterday has taken a toll on you. Rest up. I need you to be more alert tomorrow. Oh, thank God. Thank you, sir, she whispered, for once feeling something akin to affection and gratitude toward the man. Go on now, Knight, he said, the words brusque and the tone businesslike. Before I change my mind. She resisted the impish urge to salute, and after he'd followed the other three people out onto the humid, bustling sidewalk, she got out her cell phone to contact the driver. Half an hour later, she was back in the air-conditioned splendor of the car and happily chatting with the driver, Daisuke. He spoke fluent English and very sweetly pointed out a few of the interesting sights to her, giving her a brief history lesson while he was at it. Cleo was disappointed when they arrived back at the hotel. She was tempted to venture out on her own, since she had this unexpected free time, but hunger and exhaustion had really taken their toll on her, and by the time she got back to her room, she was dragging so badly that eating didn't even occur to her. She discarded her clothes on her way to the bed and fell face down onto the covers. She was asleep seconds later. Miss Knight? The regrettably familiar masculine voice resonated through Cleo's pleasant dream. She frowned and turned away from it, happily rejoining the cotton candy sheep she'd been frolicking with just moments before. The sheep were cute, friendly, and delicious. She took a bite out of a particularly friendly fellow's sugary pink fleece and relished the sweetness. "The sheep bought and Miss Knight." "Sheep can't talk," she muttered. "What?" the voice asked impatiently. Cleo sighed and reluctantly opened her eyes. "Oh, it's you," she groused when she met her boss's intense gaze. She blew her hair out of her face and pushed herself up, only to realize she was wearing just a pair of panties and no bra, and didn't have so much as a sheet covering her. She squeaked and grabbed a pillow to cover her front. She scampered back against the headboard and pulled her knees up to her chest, sandwiching the pillow between her lap and torso. She glared at Dante, who stared back at her impassively from his position at the foot of her bed. "I've seen it all in exquisite detail before," he reminded her, and she blushed. "What are you doing in my room?" "The concierge told me you didn't order any room service, and Daisuke informed me that you didn't stop for food en route to the hotel." "And?" she asked belligerently, despite the fact that his words brought her hunger screaming painfully back. "I ordered you a late dinner. I figured you might want to freshen up or something before it got here." "A late dinner?" she repeated, trying hard not to be charmed by that sweet gesture. It was the least he could do, after all, since he was the reason she was starving in the first place. "What time is it?" "Just after midnight. I got in about half an hour ago." "The meeting ran that late?" she asked, surprised. "No, but we got a lot done, and the Japanese wanted to celebrate with a night on the town followed by some." He grimaced and then shook his head. "Never mind." Intrigued by the slight flush darkening his cheekbones, she leaned forward, forgetting momentarily that only a pillow shielded her from his view. "Followed by some what?" She pictured strip clubs or those hostess bars she'd read up on, maybe something even kinkier. What else could make him look so uncomfortable? "Nothing? It's none of your business," he dismissed rudely. But sitting there, nearly completely nude, groggy from hours of sleep, and with the room only half lit, Cleo lost all inhibition and sense of self-preservation and refused to heed the warning in his voice. "It can't be that bad. I mean, everybody knows about the hostess bars and stuff over here." "Was it something like that? Did you have some pretty young thing sitting on your lap all evening, telling you how handsome and strong you are?" "I don't need to pay a woman to tell me I'm handsome and strong." "True, I'm sure Ms. Inokawa was happy to do that for you," she said snidely. "Jealous, Knight?" She laughed incredulously at the question and waved a hand, the pillow slipping dangerously low. "Hardly. You're having a bit of a, how do you say this, wardrobe malfunction." She gasped when a quick look down confirmed one of her nipples was indeed peeking up above the pillow. She hastily adjusted before looking back up to meet his avid gaze. "Stop staring at me like that," she snapped. "Like what?" "Like you're hoping it'll happen again." "But I am hoping it'll happen again." She gasped again, sounding even to herself like some outraged Victorian maiden. "That's a highly inappropriate thing to say," she pointed out, and he covered his mouth with his fist and coughed slightly, making her wonder if he was hiding a laugh behind the cough. "And me, standing here in your bedroom, while you lounge around in only your panties, isn't inappropriate?" There are levels of inappropriate behavior, she informed him primly, not even sure herself what the hell she was talking about. How could she be rattling on about appropriate behavior after everything they'd done the night before? Oh? He sat down at the foot of her bed. Please do educate me. Sitting on your bed, how inappropriate is this? On a scale of 1 to 10? 10 being highly inappropriate. 5, maybe, she whispered. And if I moved a little closer? He shifted up until his butt rested beside her feet. 5.5. The words were barely audible, but he nodded before running the back of his large hand over her feet, then her slender shins, before turning his hand over so his palm did the downward stroke back to her feet. What about that? He rasped as his breathing got a little heavier. He cupped her small feet in his hand, his thumb caressing the instep of the top foot. She fought to gather her scattered thoughts so she could respond. 6.5. A full point up, he mused. Impressive. He shifted even closer, and before she knew it, he tugged the pillow away, leaving her without the precious barrier. She yelped in protest, but he paid her no heed, and Cleo's heart slammed into her ribcage as he slid his broad chest into the space that had just been occupied by the pillow, and he was nowhere near as soft and comfortable. He was hard and hot, and smelled much too good. Suddenly all Cleo could think about was last night, and how fantastic he had felt above her, inside her, all around her, and all she wanted was more of the same. He dropped his head and nuzzled the sensitive spot on her neck, just below her ear, his lips grazing against the rapid pulse there. He sucked lightly, then bit, and when she groaned, he licked away the sting. I don't like doing things by half measure, he muttered into her ear, his hot breath sending goosebumps careening across every inch of her skin and tightening her nipples painfully. I want a perfect score. With that, he lifted his head and planted a deep, hungry kiss on her lips, and Cleo happily opened up for him, drinking him in, wanting him desperately. Every hot, hard, sexy, arrogant, unlikable part of him, she whimpered, once again fighting with that reasonable part of her that kept trying to insert itself into her business. She dragged her lips from his, a little shocked she could get this turned on from just one kiss. I thought we weren't going to do this again, she whispered. And for a moment, while he continued to nuzzle and suck on her neck, she thought he hadn't heard her. But that would be a waste of some perfectly good sex. Dulzura. He ran his large hand down her naked back as he said the words, and Cleo found herself purring like a kitten in response to the caress. It was pretty good, wasn't it? She hummed, doing a bit of her own nuzzling. She loved the feel of his expensive silk shirt against her pebbled breasts, and lost all inhibition, blatantly rubbing them against his chest, wanting him to start focusing on the important stuff now. He complied, shifting until she was flat on her back, and he was sitting on the side of the bed, with the upper half of his body bent over hers. His hot gaze traveled from her face down to her breasts, and with a shaky groan, he lifted his hands to cup and caress the pretty little mounds. He plumped one up to receive his mouth, and when he tugged at the aching nipple with his lips, Cleo nearly came out of her skin. She'd always had unbearably sensitive breasts, which Dante hadn't paid much attention to the night before, but seemed to be taking great delight in now. "Can you come from just this?" he asked huskily. "From someone playing with your breasts?" "I haven't yet," she managed to wheeze out, and he gave her a rakish little smirk. "Ah, another challenge," he said, before bending back down to her breasts. "Well, Dulzura, allow me." More than an hour later, Cleo lay on her back, chest still heaving, body still shuddering, and an arm draped across her eyes to block out her embarrassment at how completely uninhibited she had been with the man snoring gently beside her. She could now check the whole orgasming from just breast play thing off her bucket list. He had certainly risen to the challenge there. He hadn't cheated once. No sneaky hands drifting south. And when she'd attempted to hasten things along with her own hands, he had firmly moved them back up to his chest. After all that delicious foreplay, she had been more than ready for him to move on to the main event. But nope, he had made it his duty to find as many of her erogenous zones as possible before finally claiming her body. As before, once he finished, he simply rolled off her and fell asleep, this time in her bed, which was a little annoying and meant she would have to retreat to the spare room. She got up and tugged on the huge, white fluffy robe the hotel provided and padded toward the door. She didn't really know what the protocol was in this situation, but knew he wasn't the type to sleep through the night with a woman. She threw a resentful look back at the inconsiderate ass sprawled across her bed, and then sighed a little at what a fine ass he actually had. He lay in absolute naked magnificence, face down, one leg bent at the knee and the other straight. His arms were up above his head, and his face was buried in a marshmallowy pillow. As she watched, he turned his head toward her so he could breathe easier. She paused, riveted by how vulnerable he looked in his sleep. How much younger. She reluctantly admitted to herself that he was a remarkable man. To take his family's ailing hotel brand and turn it into this multi-billion-dollar corporation in less than 10 years was an almost unheard-of feat. He was only 33, and to achieve so much at such a young age, he would have had to be ruthless and cutthroat. Play hard, work harder was his motto, or at least, that's what the newspapers and tabloids often quoted him as saying. Even if she wanted more from him, Cleo knew she didn't stand a chance of being much more than a lay to this powerful, handsome man. But that was fine. She didn't want more from him, since he was nothing more than a fantastic lay to her. As long as they both understood that, everything would be fine. She turned away from him and slipped into the huge, elegantly furnished living room that spanned the distance between their rooms. Her eyes immediately fell on the service cart, standing in the middle of the floor. She moaned, her appetite roaring to life, with such ferocity that she almost swayed with hunger. She lifted the domed lids off each dish and almost cried at the congealed mess that was all that remained of what had once been a beautiful dinner. She padded over to one of the ornate sideboards and reached for the telephone to call room service and order another meal. It was nearly 1:30, and she felt invigorated after all that glorious sex, not tired in the least. And as she stood at the floor-to-ceiling window and stared down at the sparkling city lights below, she wondered what adventures were to be had out there. A reckless desire to go exploring surged to life, and she tamped it down, knowing that wandering around in a huge city like this, on her own, in the middle of the night would be stupid. She sank into one of the massive Bacoco armchairs, angled toward the window, and folded her legs up in front of her, wrapping her arms around them and resting her chin on her knees. "What are you doing in here?" A few minutes later, Dante's sleep-roughened voice startled her, and she squeaked slightly before turning her head to watch him enter the room. "I didn't think you were the type of guy who liked to wake up next to the night's casual shag, so I retreated. Since you were passed out in my room, I thought I'd take the spare room tonight." "Still doesn't tell me why you're in here," he pointed out, a sweeping arm indicating that he meant the living room. "I'm waiting for room service," she said, "and don't you dare distract me again. I can't go much longer without food." His lips quirked, and he sat down in one of the other chairs, angling his body toward her. She averted her eyes when she comprehended that he was still naked. How had she not noticed that immediately? "Do you mind covering up?" she asked, not as comfortable with his nudity as he clearly was. "Why? Is it inappropriate for me to walk around like this?" he asked, and she clenched her teeth. "You know it is, but after last night and what we just did in the other room, I think we have probably gone way off the scale by now. This can't be much more than a 4, surely." "I'm not playing this game with you again," she gritted out. "Just put on some clothes before room service gets here." "I don't think this is about room service. I think you find me irresistible." "Get over yourself," she muttered, hating that damned smug look on his face. He yanked one of the chair cushions out from behind his back and placed it neatly over his crotch, folding his hands over the top of the embroidered pillow. "What?" he challenged at her dubious look. "This worked for you earlier." It hadn't really worked that well, considering the events that followed, but Cleo wasn't about to bring that up now. The doorbell chimed, and she jumped up, grateful for the distraction. She could have hugged the waiter when he pushed the cart into the room. "Tip him," she ordered Dante, already lifting the lids off the bowls and dishes, her knees almost buckling at the divine smells. "Bossy little thing, aren't you?" he murmured directly into her ear as he came to stand behind her, close enough for his body heat to penetrate the thickness of her robe. The waiter kept his eyes averted as Dante signed for the meal and added a generous tip. The waiter thanked them and beat a hasty retreat. "You're naked again, aren't you?" Cleo asked, without turning her head. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, his hands dropped to her shoulders and kneaded gently. He was pressed to her body, and his growing erection started to make its presence known against her back, even through the thickness of the robe. "Not naked again," he denied. "More like still." His lips dropped to her earlobe, and he sucked it into his mouth, giving it a little nip in the process. Cleo moaned, and as he ground his substantial erection against her, she pushed back until he groaned appreciatively. His hand reached around and slid into the front of her robe, finding her breast with unerring accuracy. Cleo allowed him a squeeze before looking down at the food in front of her and stepping away from him. She turned around to face him and dropped a quick glance down at his huge, straining penis, which had her salivating for a completely different reason. "Put that thing away," she said softly, nodding down at it decisively. "You and your insatiable penis will not be distracting me from my food this time." He turned away from her, and she could have sworn she heard a chuckle which just about melted her heart, because Dante Damaso was not prone to humor. "Eat your food, Floresita. You'll need the energy for later." He really was a cocky son of a bitch, but Cleo was beyond caring about that right now, and she carried her food, a salad, penny carbonara, and cheesecake for dessert, over to the expensive-looking coffee table in front of her chair by the window. Dante followed her and sat down, with his pillow thankfully shielding his impressive package from her again. His eyes were intent as he watched her eat, and after satisfying her immediate hunger by scarfing down the first half of her meal with great gusto, Cleo grew more and more self-conscious beneath that relentless gaze. "Please stop staring at me," she finally said around a mouthful of penne. "I like looking at you." Well, that was completely out of left field. She felt her mouth gaping, knowing that with the half-masticated pasta in there, she probably looked like a drooling idiot. She recovered quickly and shut her mouth, barely bothering to chew the rest of the mouthful before swallowing. "What?" "I like looking at you," he repeated. "You're interesting." Well, at least he hadn't lied and called her pretty. She knew she had a weird face. For one thing, her lips were too big in a too narrow face. Her schoolmates had nastily called her juicy lips throughout primary school, and in high school, the boys had started making all kinds of offensive suggestions about the things she should be doing with those juicy lips. Then there was her crooked nose, broken when she'd fallen during a dance rehearsal years ago. It wasn't horrendous, and after the surgery to fix the damage had failed, Cleo resigned herself to accepting her slightly off-center nose. And finally, there were her ridiculously big green eyes, which had people likening her to a baby doll for most of her life. Cleo hated her bug eyes. She thought they made her look continually surprised. Her ridiculous face, combined with the petite body, often led people to underestimate her. That had been an asset while she was pursuing her dance career. She had wanted to be underestimated before wowing her competitors and choreographers with her talent. Choreographers and directors loved that unexpected quality about her, had raved about her freshness and her quirkiness. But now, in the real world, being underestimated led to fewer opportunities and greater frustrations. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Dante's voice intruded upon her troubling thoughts, and she focused her attention back on him. "I was thinking." She cleared her throat before affecting a cocky grin and reaching for her dessert. "I was thinking you still haven't told me what you did after dinner tonight. Did you go to one of those onsen places?" She was referring to the public hot spas that were so popular in Japan. "Did you have to get naked with Mr. Tanaka and Mr. Watanabe?" He winced at the question. "Dios, no. Then it really can't be that bad, can it?" She enjoyed needling him. His embarrassment made him seem a little more approachable. "Anything my imagination dredges up will probably be a lot worse than reality." "We went to karaoke," he said, finally relenting, and Cleo choked on her first bite of cheesecake. "You're being overly dramatic," he scoffed, as she waved her hand in front of her face to cool her skin after her coughing fit. "Karaoke?" she finally managed on a wheeze, and he nodded. "Seriously?" "Yes. Can I have some of that cheesecake?" he asked casually. "No, she replied equally casually, deliberately sticking another forkful in her mouth and chewing slowly before asking her next question. Did you actually sing? See. His eyes dropped to the remaining cheesecake on her plate. Just a bite? No, she said, as she took another teasing forkful. What did you sing? A bit of Queen, some Rolling Stones, a little Nirvana, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Blondie, he recited. You don't seriously mean to eat that entire piece of cake, do you? I do, she affirmed. Blondie? Seriously? And Cyndi Lauper, he grimaced. Ms. Inokawa really likes their songs, but can't sing them because the English is a bit too fast-paced for her. But they're so high-pitched, she laughed. I know. Can we stop talking about this now? And I warn you, this remains between us. Now give me some of that cake. No, it's my cake. Get your own dessert. Okay. Oh my God, what are you doing? She asked seconds later, when he knelt in front of her chair and ran his hands from her knees to her thighs, parting her robe as he did so. She hurriedly put her cake aside as she stared down at him in shock. Getting my dessert, he mumbled, moving his hands beneath her butt and dragging her to the edge of the chair until he had her spread wide open in front of him. The corners of his lips quirked upward before he hummed in contentment, bent his head, and feasted. Cleo, her own dessert forgotten, stared down at the top of his dark head in disbelief until his very talented tongue started to work its magic on her. She arched back in the chair and entangled her fingers in his hair as her eyes drifted shut. Oh, my God! The rest of their time in Tokyo sped by. Dante didn't micromanage Cleo as much as before, solely because he didn't have the time to oversee her every little move. She did her work efficiently and gave him no cause for complaint. Their nights were equally busy. They never spoke about it, never gave what was happening between them a name. But they spent every night together having mind-blowing sex. And when it was over, Cleo always retreated to her room, and Dante never made any attempt to call her back. And if she ever had any doubts as to the nature of their relationship, his indifference and distance during the day when he was focused on work certainly made things clear. He never, by word or by deed, let on that theirs was anything more than a working relationship. Yet, he had a chocolate-glazed donut waiting for her at whatever conference room they happened to find themselves in on any given day, and he always ensured that her plate was full at lunchtime and that the menu would be palatable for her. When they headed back to the hotel in the evenings, Daisuke always took a different route, so she got to see a bit of the city, which she suspected was Dante's doing as well. It was all so sweet, Cleo didn't know how to respond to it. By their last day, the zoning problem had been completely ironed out, and everybody was in a celebratory mood. They would break ground on the new hotel in less than a month. Tonight, we will have an enkai to celebrate this wonderful occasion, Ms. Inokawa stated happily. This is a very formal Japanese event, so there will be many speeches, but after that, we will all enjoy drinking together and have many after-parties. Her pretty eyes slid to Dante in clear invitation, and Cleo pretended not to see the smile he slanted the woman in return. Of course she wasn't jealous. Dante Damaso meant nothing to her. Just a bit of fun, a casual fling. So that evening, as they were preparing to leave the hotel, Cleo suggested she stay behind. After all, she told herself magnanimously, he might feel a bit awkward flirting with Ms. Inokawa while Cleo was hanging about. You're not staying behind. You've read enough of those etiquette books to know that it's damned bad manners, he snapped. He'd been in a pretty foul mood most of the day, despite the news that his new hotel had gotten the green light. Cleo sighed and checked her appearance in the mirror one final time. She was wearing yet another variation of the same boring skirt, jacket, and blouse combo that she had rocked the entire week. She truly hated her work wardrobe. It wasn't at all to her taste. She was more at home in torn jeans and t-shirts, or slip dresses with long bohemian skirts, than in these horrendous suits that made her feel like a trussed-up pigeon. She didn't know who she was when she wore these clothes. Because this was a work-related enkai, everyone would be dressed in business suits. Dante looked his usual dashing self in a three-piece, pinstriped, navy blue bespoke Desmond Marion suit with a white shirt, red tie, and Tonino Cresci Lillian shoes, all of which she knew were ridiculously expensive because she had seen his personal bills. The man looked gorgeous and smelled luxurious. Cleo, on the other hand, just felt frumpy in her department store knockoff gray pencil skirt, matching blazer, and pink cotton blouse. Ugh! And the sensible black pumps she was wearing were completely hideous, too. Let's go. Dante ushered her out of the suite and to the elevator, and Cleo tried to drum up some enthusiasm for the event. At least she would get to see someplace other than a boring conference room in a bleak building. I hope the food's good, she said, once they were in the elevator. He stood beside her, close enough for her to feel his body heat without physically touching him. His hands were clasped in front of him, and his feet were braced shoulder-width apart. He looked like a soldier ready for battle. He merely grunted, and she raised her eyebrows. So it was going to be like that, was it?
Right then.
She didn't say another word until they were seated in the car. Daisuke greeted them enthusiastically,
like he hadn't seen them just hours before, and Cleo smiled warmly at him before continuing the fascinating conversation about Japanese pop culture that they'd been having earlier. He was entertaining and genuinely funny, and it wasn't long before Cleo was laughing at some of his anecdotes.
My girlfriend loves Purikura, and she has many hundreds of tiny pictures of herself and her friends. He told Cleo about something called Print Club, specialized photo booths found in most malls that took tiny airbrushed pictures, which could be photoshopped before being printed. Do you have any pictures, Dai? Cleo asked curiously. I only go to Purikura with Mickey, he explained. Mickey was his girlfriend. He flipped down the sun visor and retrieved the pictures he had stashed behind the mirror. He handed them back to her, and Cleo exclaimed in delight over the colorful, brightly decorated little photographs of Daisuke and a pretty girl. She turned toward Dante to share the images with him, but he was staring out the window, ignoring them, his jaw tightly clenched as he glared at the passing scenery. Her smile slipped a little as she stared at the back of his head, wondering what was going on with him. She handed the pictures back to Daisuke. They're really cute. I wish I'd had time to take a few myself. She could hear the wistful note in her voice and told herself to snap out of it. She was here for work, not vacation. Mickey is really pretty, Dai, How long have you guys been dating? 2 years, he beamed proudly. She is studying to be a teacher. Fabulous. What will she teach? He looked stumped for a moment as he considered her question. She will be a shodo no sensei. A penmanship teacher? He looked uncertain. She will teach the art of Japanese writing. Oh? Cleo was not quite sure what he meant, but didn't want to embarrass him. Every stroke must be correct. It is almost artistic. Very difficult. He glanced around before pointing to an incomprehensible sign written in bold black Japanese. Like this. You mean like in cursive? Christ, Dante suddenly said beneath his breath. He means Japanese calligraphy. Oh, she breathed, feeling like a complete idiot for not realizing that immediately. You know it? Daisuke asked eagerly, and Cleo nodded. Yes, I read about it. I should have known when you said artistic writing, she said apologetically. It's okay. My English is very bad, he said with a diffident grin. That was such a staggering untruth that Cleo's mouth dropped open. Your English is great, Daisuke, she said firmly, and he waved a hand in front of his face. No, very bad. But it's not bad at all. Thank you, he said so abruptly she blinked. What? The whole exchange left her feeling a little confused and flustered. She hoped she hadn't offended him by implying his English was bad. Let it go, Knight, Dante muttered, clearly not as oblivious to their conversation as he had appeared to be earlier. But it's the Japanese way to be self-effacing. Just leave it. She nodded, even though it went against every instinct she had to just comply with what could only be described as a command. She changed the subject, asking Dai a question about the relatively new Tokyo Sky Tree. It was obviously a subject he took great pride and passion in. And by the time they reached their destination, 5 minutes later, Cleo knew exactly how tall the building was, how long it had taken to construct, how many men had worked on it, and how people from all over Japan flocked to come and visit the tallest tower in the world, a point of pride for most Japanese people. Cleo was still thinking about how much she would have loved to see the views from the observation deck of the Sky Tree while they were being ushered into the restaurant by Ms. Inokawa, who'd been waiting for them at the entrance. Their party was being held in an extremely traditional Japanese room. It had straw mats called tatami on the floor, and rice paper or shoji doors and panels. The decor was very minimalist, featuring only one long, very low table in the center of the room, with flat cushions known as zabuton on the floor beside each place setting. There were no chairs. Cleo immediately felt intimidated by the room, not sure what would be expected of her, and not wanting to offend in her ignorance. Knight-san, please. Ms. Inokawa gestured toward a spot close to the end of the long table before she ushered Dante up to the pride of place, dead center of the table. She bowed, left him there on his own, and rejoined Cleo. Other somber-suited people filed into the room, while Ms. Inokawa gestured for Cleo to sit down beside her. Wondering if there was any graceful way to sit on the floor in a tight skirt, Cleo clumsily sank down, flat on her butt with her legs folded to the side. Knight-san, Ms. Inokawa leaned over to whisper abashedly, because this is a formal party, we will sit in Seiza. In what? Like this. Ms. Inokawa sat beside Cleo, folding herself up delicately on the way down. Cleo grimaced, already dreading what was to come because there was no way in hell she could sit like that. The other woman was on her knees, with her legs folded beneath her thighs and her feet tucked neatly beneath her bum. How long will we have to sit like that? It is usually proper for women to sit this way for the entire party. Really, and the men. They too will sit in Caesar, but after a while they will probably cross their legs. I can't sit like that, Cleo whispered urgently. Ms. Inokawa's perfect brow furrowed ever so slightly, and she affected a lovely look of helpless distress. Dante, who could see everything from his central position on the opposite side of the table, got to his feet and ambled around to their end of the table. Is there a problem here? He asked, and Ms. Inokawa bowed gracefully before shaking her head. There is no problem, Damaso-san. Rather surprised that the other woman didn't rat her out, Cleo slanted her a shocked glance before meeting Dante's eyes. I can't sit like this. She gestured to where Ms. Inokawa sat like the perfect epitome of modesty and beauty. Everybody will be sitting in Caesar, Dante pointed out. Cleo nodded and tried very hard not to react to his impatience. So I've heard, she said. Dante sighed and glanced up as several important-looking men, some of whom she'd never seen before, entered the room. I don't have time for this, Knight. Stop playing childish and attention-seeking games, and don't embarrass me, he growled, before striding away, leaving Cleo humiliated. She was absolutely and unexpectedly shattered that he had spoken to her like that in front of Ms. Inokawa, who was very discreetly keeping her gaze focused on her place setting. Cleo blinked hard when she realized that her eyes had actually gone misty, and she was annoyed with herself for letting him get to her. Still, after a week of sexing her up, surely he'd noticed the extensive scarring on her right knee. Surely he'd wondered about it. She knew every single detail of his body, every little imperfection, of which there were few, every nook and crevice, and he hadn't noticed the huge and ugly vertical scar on her knee. Well, wasn't that just a much-needed reality check for Cleo? She had to be careful around this man. She had to guard her heart, because while she had started to soften toward him, he hadn't ever seen her as more than a casual hookup. We can start in Caesar, Ms. Inokawa leaned over to whisper conspiratorially. But after everybody has had a few drinks, no one will notice if we move our legs to the side and sit on our behinds. Surprised by the sympathy and camaraderie in the other woman's voice, Cleo looked up and saw genuine warmth in her eyes. Great. As if the whole situation with Dante wasn't bad enough, she'd gone and completely misjudged Ms. Inokawa as well. I'd like that, she said, with a watery smile. I have a bad knee. I don't know how long it'll hold up if I were to sit like that for too long. Don't worry, Ms. Inokawa said, with a swift pat on Cleo's hand. It won't be long before the beers start to take effect. Cleo giggled when the other woman winked dramatically and started to think that maybe this entire evening wouldn't be too much of an ordeal after all. 15 minutes later, her knee was screaming in agony. She could no longer feel her lower legs, and yet another man had started yet another long-winded speech. She suppressed a moan and wished there was some discreet way to shift her legs out from beneath her thighs without drawing everybody's attention to the movement. She was very much aware of the glances Dante was throwing in her direction and fought to keep her face impassive even while she felt like weeping. Finally, everybody raised their small glasses of beer and held them aloft. The speaker said a few more things before ending with a word Cleo was happily familiar with. "Kanpai!" He yelled the Japanese version of cheers, and everybody followed suit. "Kanpai!" There was loud and manly laughter, Cleo and Miss Inokawa being the only women present, as everybody clinked glasses and started drinking. "It's okay for you to move your legs to the side now," Ms. Inokawa whispered, obviously sensing her distress. "I don't think I can move my legs," Cleo whispered back, while she painfully tried to shift her position without crying out. "Daijubu?" the woman asked, and Cleo recognized the question, which she'd heard often over the course of the week, as, "Are you okay?" She shrugged miserably. "I'll probably be okay once I get the feeling back in my legs. They've fallen asleep." Although her knee was a different matter entirely, she wasn't sure if she'd done some damage to it, but it definitely didn't feel all right. She tried to placate the woman with a smile and picked up the bottle of beer placed in front of her and held it up to Ms. Inokawa. "May I?" It was traditional to pour for the people seated closest to you, and considered poor form to allow your neighbor's glass to run dry. The guy on her right, whom she didn't know at all, was holding a bottle up and smiling expectantly, and even though she pretty much hated beer, she managed a smile and a nod while he added the drop of beer that would be needed to fill the glass to the brim again. If she didn't stay alert, she would probably wind up extremely drunk, because it was almost impossible to monitor one's alcohol intake in a situation like this. Things got rowdy quite quickly, and it was a little shocking to watch the previously somber Japanese businessmen get wasted and exceptionally loud and cheerful in pretty short order. Nobody remained seated. Pouring etiquette went out the window, and soon people were crawling about on the floor, from one person to the next, chatting and topping up each other's beers. She noticed that quite a few of the men had immediately moved toward Dante and were all vying to pour his drinks. He took the time to chat amicably. A few of the younger men made a point of talking with her, some in great English, others a little less fluently. Cleo forced aside her pain, kept smiling, and delighted the men when she butchered a few of the standard Japanese phrases she'd learned over the course of the week. They were ridiculously flattering of her bad Japanese, and remembering Daisuke's reaction in the car earlier, she modestly waved off their compliments. She turned to say something to Ms. Inokawa, but the woman was gone. Cleo cast her gaze toward Dante, expecting to see the woman fawning over him, but she wasn't there. Dante, however, met and held her eyes for a few long moments. His face was completely inscrutable, almost grim. Cleo frowned and wondered if he was pissed off with her. Yet again, she was the first to break eye contact, still looking for Ms. Inokawa, and she was surprised to see the other woman blatantly flirting with Craig Templeton, the contractor for the hotel build. The handsome older man was smiling and flirting back. Well, that was new. Cleo turned her gaze back to Dante to see if Ms. Inokawa's shift in romantic attentions bothered him, but he was still watching Cleo intently. His complete focus was starting to make her a little hot under the collar, and she shifted restlessly. Unfortunately, the inadvertent movement caused a shaft of pain to shoot through her knee, and she flinched. Dante's entire body went still, and his head tilted slightly to the left as he watched her quizzically. In that moment, he reminded her of a wild animal on the scent trail of something small and wounded, and Cleo desperately tried to throw him off that trail with a casual grin and a careless wiggle of her fingers. As expected, the frivolous and flirtatious wave did the trick, and he gave her a frown before returning his attention to one of the many sycophants huddling around him. Cleo heaved a relieved sigh and gave her knee a surreptitious little massage before focusing on one of the earnest young men trying to have a conversation with her. It was going to be a long night. At around 2 the following morning, Cleo was more than ready to call it quits. The merry group had dragged Cleo and Dante from one night spot to another and was now insisting on karaoke. "I have to get back to the hotel," she whispered to Dante, who didn't look as drunk as the rest of their loud group. In fact, he looked much too sober for a man who'd been drinking all night, and she wondered about that for a few moments before he distracted her with a glare. "You have to do no such thing," he snapped, keeping his voice low. By now her knee was radiating almost constant pain, and all Cleo wanted was a hot bath, pain medication, and a long, long sleep.
"You don't need me here. This isn't part of my job description, and you can't force me to stay."
"One of your unofficial duties is to accompany me to business lunches and dinners." "Unofficial as in not contracted," she pointed out, and he rubbed the nape of his neck before switching tactics. "Okay then, what about coming along in a personal capacity as my—" He struggled to find a definition, and she raised a brow and folded her arms across her chest. "Girlfriend," she supplied, and he blanched. "God, no." "Mistress?" If possible, he went even paler. "Absolutely not." He hesitated a few moments longer before shrugging and continuing, "As my friend." "We're friends?" "Of a sort. Well, be a pal and let me go to bed. I'm tired and in pain." Okay. She hadn't meant to reveal that last bit. It just slipped out. His eyes narrowed. "In pain?" "Yeah, my knee hurts," she confessed. "This is why you have been limping since we left the first restaurant?" He had noticed that. She had tried very hard to disguise the slight limp. "Damaso-san," one of the other men called from a few meters away. "You are coming." "Chado mat," Dante snapped back. "Give me a moment." Cleo still stood with her arms crossed and her bad knee bent so that her other leg was taking most of her weight. "Explain," he commanded, pointing to her knee. "I have a weak knee, and sitting in Caesar made it flare up a bit." He swore colorfully in about 3 different languages before running an agitated hand through his hair. "What's wrong with your knee?" he asked after a moment, and she huffed impatiently. "You've seen every inch of my body," she said. "I assumed that, over the course of the week, you'd have noticed the great, ugly scar on my knee." "Of course I did," he admitted, "and I've been meaning to ask you about it. Only you've never had the time," she completed. Where would he find the time? At night, he was fully occupied with seducing her, and his days were dominated by back-to-back meetings required to get his precious hotel built. And then there was the obvious fact that he simply didn't care enough to delve into personal details. They didn't speak about anything other than superficial nonsense when they were alone at night, and once the sex started, the conversation dwindled down to what felt good and where. I was aware of the scar. I just never really appreciated that your knee might have been weakened by it, which was foolish considering the extent of the scarring. But in my defense, it never seems to bother you. You usually walk without impediment, and you're quite limber, as I can personally attest. His comment flashed her back to 2 nights before, when they'd had sex in the middle of his room, his hands supporting her butt and her legs wrapped around his waist, without even a wall to bolster them. It had been quite a testament to his strength and her flexibility. Only their mutual orgasms had finally sent them sinking down to the carpeted floor. She flushed at the memory and felt uncomfortably hot as she remembered how intense that session had been. The fear of falling combined with the excitement of maintaining rhythm and balance. Anyway, she said, hoping to divert them both back to the point at hand, the knee doesn't really bother me unless I'm testing it. And trust me, that Caesar thing tested it sorely. How old is the injury? He asked, looking deeply uncomfortable with the question, and she knew it was because he felt compelled to ask her a personal question, to make himself look and possibly feel like less of an uncaring dick. I injured it about 3 years ago, she recalled, her lips twisting as she remembered the catastrophic fall that had killed all of her dreams. What happened? Again, the question sounded torn from him. He clearly hated asking, and probably had no real interest in the answer. I had an accident and needed knee surgery. The end. You don't have to ask me any more questions, sir. You've shown an interest. Noted. He said nothing, merely watched her for a very long moment, that handsome face maddeningly blank. So be it. He shrugged dismissively. We will return to the hotel. You don't have to go back. I can make it back on my own. Undoubtedly, he agreed, but I find myself rather tired. Do you? She asked on a whisper, and his lips quirked in that sexy, dreadful cat that got the cream grin. Ish. What? She asked, although she knew exactly what he meant by that. I'm tired-ish, he clarified, even though the expression on his face suggested he knew he didn't really have to. I may find my second wind by the time we return to the hotel. Of course he would, and did. Breakfast felt different. Usually the meal, which was always delivered to their suite, was eaten in a rush while Dante rapid-fired a list of the day's requirements at Cleo. Today, with the urgency of the week behind them, and the memory of the previous night's fantastic sex still throbbing between them, everything felt odd, different, wrong. They would leave for the airport in under an hour, and they were in this weird space of nothingness where everything had been arranged and there was no more to be done other than enjoy the rare moment of peace and quiet. Only it wasn't peaceful, and it was much too quiet. Cleo swallowed a piece of toast that felt like sandpaper as it slid down her dry throat. She chased it down with some acidic orange juice and wondered at her nervousness. She got up and restlessly made her way over to the huge picture windows beside the Bacoco armchairs, which now had some pretty raunchy memories attached to them. There was a layer of smog hanging over the city that did nothing to detract from Tokyo's vibrancy. She had voraciously read her guidebook from beginning to end, diligently folding over the pages dedicated to places that she had longed to see, promising herself she would come back and visit someday. She knew that it was unlikely to happen, and considered herself lucky to have seen this much of it at least, from way up in her glass tower and the claustrophobic confines of the car. Miss Knight. Dante's quiet voice intruded upon her thoughts, and she couldn't help but wonder if he'd called her Miss Knight because he'd forgotten her name again. The absolute ludicrousness of a man who knew her body better than she did addressing her so formally caused a tiny burble of hysterical laughter to rise in her chest. She swallowed it back down, instinct telling her he wouldn't appreciate her humor right now. She turned to face him, hiding a grimace when her still sore knee twinged in response to the movement. Sure enough, the grim set of his jaw and the tense line of his mouth confirmed that he was ready to have a serious discussion.